Well, good evening and welcome. I'm Sue Boyer, president of the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory, and tonight we conclude our fall lecture series and are pleased to welcome you as we learn all about grasses and sedges. As part of the Friends mission, we want to help educate and inspire gardeners to become more confident in their endeavors. This is the last of our fall lecture series. Our winter series will begin in January with seed starting and winter sowing, and a program on growing orchids in February. On Saturday, November 16th, from 10 to 1, we wanted to let you know about the Winter Greens Open House. There will be a live demonstration of how to create holiday containers and wreaths, and these demonstrations will be going on throughout the day. Refreshments will be served, no registrations required, and we hope you'll be able to stop by on Saturday, November 16th. But if you can't come that day, we just want to remind you that beginning November 15th through December 15th, from 10 to 4 p.m. each day, you can shop the Oak Park Conservatory's Winter Green Market for a selection of winter greens for your home. An array of fresh greens, including balsam, fern, boxwood, winterberries, magnolia tips, spruce tops, and more will be available, along with many other natural items for your winter decoration. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our special guest this evening. Erin Garrett is the Natural Resources, Environment, and Energy Extension educator for the University of Illinois Extension in the southernmost 5 counties in Illinois. In this role, Erin develops and delivers high-impact programming to local and statewide audiences to help them develop an appreciation for natural resources and to empower them to make small changes to positively impact the environment. And before we start our presentation, I just wanted to remind you that Casey Nikoloff is our co-host, and she'll be managing the Q&A this evening. But as you have your questions, please go ahead and put them in. We would also ask you to remain muted and to turn off your video for the presentation. Will give us better reception. And now, Erin, I turn it over to you. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Sue. I'm happy to be here with you all this evening. And today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and that is grasses and sedges. And we're going to be talking about them in the home landscape today. So I've got a lot of slides. We'll see what we can get through, but this is kind of the outline of what we're going to go through today. Most of the work that I talk about is about grasses, but it was requested that I throw some sedges in there. So I've done a little extra research and put in some more information about sedges just to kind of break those down for us today. So we'll look at kind of what separates those different grasses from sedges, and then we'll look at their role in the home garden, kind of why we want to consider native versus non-native grasses and sedges in the home landscape. And then we'll talk a little bit about where to purchase these plants, how to plant them, how to maintain them. And then we'll finish with kind of the selection of what are some of the top options that I would recommend when it comes to adding them into your home garden, along with some planting information for you. So we're going to dive right in and talk first about what makes a grass a grass. Okay, and I'm sure many of us have heard some variation of this phrase that's on the screen here, right? Sedges have edges, rushes are round, and grasses have nodes from the top to the ground. Okay, so besides grasses, we have 2 other groups of grass-like plants, and those are sedges and rushes. You don't really hear a lot about rushes, but that is another separate group that is there too. And there are some telltale characteristics that you can use to kind of tell apart these 3 groups of plants that go beyond this phrase, right? Because when it comes to plant identification, you know, plants don't always follow the rules. So while these are general characteristics, there are, you know, sedges that don't have triangular stems. There are grasses that have more flattened stems rather than round stems. And so we want to make sure we have a variety of characteristics to look for. Um, I included these links that I can share in the chat at the end of the presentation. But there are two really excellent guides that kind of break down grasses, sedges, and rushes. And one of them you can find at minnesotawildflowers.info. And then another one you can find from the Mount Cuba Center in one of their documents on sedges, a research report that they did that really breaks down with a lot of detail how you can tell them apart. So those are really great references to kind of have in your back pocket to use to kind of break them down. But what we're going to do is kind of go through some of the top characteristics that separate them and show some pictures to kind of break those down. So first is the phrase that I already stated, right? And so when it comes to sedges, we say they have edges. What does that mean? That means that most sedges have a triangular stem. So this is a really great photo that shows that triangular cross section, okay? Like I stated before, there is a whole group of sedges that don't have triangular stems. So we can't always use that characteristic, but that's a good first test. If you see something that looks grass-like, kind of twist that stem between your fingers. And if it has angles like this one, it's likely a sedge. Okay. Rushes typically have round stems, as do grasses. So grasses have round stems as well. But grasses have something called nodes on them, which rushes don't. So here you see a completely smooth stem. And even though you can only see a tiny part of it, the whole stem would be smooth. Whereas on a grass, you're going to have these swellings right here that are called nodes. You can think of them like a joint, like a kneecap or an elbow. That's kind of how I think of them along a grass stem. So that's something to look for that the sedges and the rushes don't have. Besides that, though, we can look at their leaves, and I included the pictures that I have, and for the most part, we're kind of going to leave the rushes out at this point because they're not really popular in home landscaping, and they're not really as common, and there aren't as many of them in our landscapes. So kind of focusing on the sedges and the grasses. When it comes to their leaves, sedges have something called three-ranked leaves. And this just means that from a single point, you'll have three leaves emerging. And that makes sense, right? If you think about them having a triangular stem, you'd see three leaves coming off from one point. Really hard to find a picture of that. So this doesn't necessarily illustrate that really well. Um, but that is something up close that you can see. Rushes don't really have a lot of leaves. And if they do have them, they're right at the base of the plant. And then grasses have two ranked leaves, which just means that they'll emerge from either side of the stem. You're not going to have three around the stem like you would in a sedge, okay? Okay, another characteristic that we can look for is something called the sheath. So on a grass, when we find, or on a sedge as well, when you have a leaf or a blade, okay, that leaf blade is going to actually wrap around the stem and form a structure called a sheath, okay? Sheaths can be um, closed or fused, or they can be open. That's another characteristic we can use to tell our sedges and our grasses apart. So in a sedge, you'll see here we have a leaf blade, and then right here you can see it wraps around the stem, forming a sheath. This would be the sheath. And you see there's no division here. It's just one solid piece. Okay, so that's a clue for us that that's a sedge. Whereas in a rush, we'd have an open sheath, but again, we'd barely have any leaves. And in a grass, we have an open sheath, which you see here, or overlapping. Okay, so a lot of grasses do have closed sheaths, but you could still kind of peel it apart and it would come apart without ripping it. Okay, so you'd see an overlap of some kind of the sheath here, and that's a clue that you would have a grass. Okay, this is a lot of text, but I'm just going to put it up here because the flower structures of grasses and sedges and rushes is complicated. This is kind of the text that goes with it, and then we're going to look. And I find that the more you look at them, the easier it is to just kind of see in general, oh, this really looks like a sedge flower, and this really looks like a grass flower, without kind of getting into the nitty gritty of these different parts of the flowers. So in sedges, your flowers can be either male, all female, or perfect, so having both of those parts together. Each of the little individual flowers called a floret has one bract, which is like a leaf-like structure underneath it, and you only get one seed per flower. Okay, so if we compare that with the grasses, we'll skip the rushes because they're kind of different. Grasses, again, we have flowers with male and female parts, but they can be at different parts on the grass. We're going to have each floret surrounded by two bracts, and you're going to get one seed per flower again. Okay, the rushes are really unique because they're going to have flower parts in multiples of 3. Okay, so really easy to see when we look at the pictures. You'll be able to count the tepals, right? So that's like a combination of a petal and a sepal is a tepal. You'll be able to count the 6 of those, and then their capsules have 3+ seeds rather than just one individual one. So you'll see clusters of seeds inside. So what does all this look like? There's a lot of really complex terminology that goes along with the different parts of the flowers that we're not going to talk about. But this is kind of the general look of the sedges, okay? In the left picture, you can see we've got, this is a male flower right here, and then the female flower is down here, okay? So sometimes they're separate in these. A lot of the time, you're going to find kind of these inflated, round-looking pieces in the sedges that kind of have this bristle structure. So you can kind of see that here. You can kind of see that on this one. So that's kind of a characteristic look of the sedges, right? And then here's another one that's in the middle. Okay, so just to kind of give some different examples of what types of flowers we're looking for. In a rush here, I've got an example on the left where if you looked really closely, we could count multiples of 3 in the tepals that we see here, in the stamens that we see as well. And then you can see in the right-hand picture, we've got clusters of capsules all together, okay? Looking at other characteristics, we can see we have a really round stem, right? And if we had the whole picture of the plant, we'd see there's barely any leaves on it. There's no nodes. So that's an easy one to tell that's a rush. And then finally, the grasses. Grasses have a lot of diversity in how their flowers look. So I tried to include some close-ups here. A lot of them include, we call the grass parts of the grass flowers spikelets, and they have a lot of overlapping scales in them, which is something you can see in this kind of zoomed in picture all the way on the left here. Here you can also see kind of the anthers and the stigmas kind of pushed out of the grass too. So that's their male and female flowers. Um, they're held separately on this grass, but on the same plant, right? The same flower. The only one that I think would be kind of tricky, I included it in here. This one could kind of look like a sedge, with the shape of the seeds that are developing with kind of that point on it. It kind of resembles a sedge. But in this case, if we look at other characteristics of the grass and the leaves and how they have a sheath, that there's nodes, we'd be able to tell it's a grass. But just to kind of break them down, I wanted to give like a general overview of those different groups of plants because I know it's really hard for a lot of people to tell them apart. It's difficult for me to tell them apart sometimes. So that's kind of the breakdown of how that works. Okay, so why would we consider putting grasses in the home garden? We're going to shift to that focus right now. They have a lot of desirable traits, right? I'm a big fan of perennials. Anything I don't have to plant every year is great for me. A lot of the grasses have a showy seed head. You can see that in this rye in this picture. Many of them have brilliant fall color. A lot of them, they grow in bunches. So they have a nice natural self-contained form, and then can provide fall and winter interest as well and add movement and sound. So some examples that we have here, this is the river oats that has a really characteristic seed head that's beautiful, striking, kind of stands out from the surrounding foliage, has beautiful fall color as well, kind of turns a golden color. Here is a whole hillside of little blue stem, which is one of my favorite grasses. Has beautiful, again, reddish orange fall color. Here, this was a new installation being put in a botanic garden where they were using a lot of native plants and a lot of bunch grasses. That just kind of shows that bunch form, right? That you can see in when planted in mass too, has a really, really great texture and forms a great ground cover. And then here, kind of the sensory element. This is river oats again that we planted in a sensory garden that we have in one of our food donation gardens because the wind moving through the leaves adds a really great sound into our garden. So lots of different uses for grasses. Sedges, we're going to get kind of the same thing, right? Again, perennials, showy seed heads. Many of them do stay evergreen. So they're going to provide that year-long greenery in our gardens and then have that bunch form again and have a good ground cover. In general, the sedges are going to perform better in shadier areas and in wetter conditions, but you don't necessarily need those conditions to plant sedges. Okay, so when we talk about why we should plant these plants, again, besides just the interest they add to our gardens, grasses are important for our wildlife and for our environments and our ecosystems. So I just included some fun pictures of some critters that I found using grasses, whether for habitat, they are used as food sources as well. And then, of course, if we looked under the ground, we'd be able to see that their really extensive root systems help build up our healthy soil systems, right? As compared to a turf grass that only has roots that are a few inches deep. A lot of our native grasses can have, roots that extend multiple feet. That's just going to help build a healthier soil community than we could ever achieve with a turf grass. Okay, I am going to talk about non-native ornamentals and kind of what native plants you could choose instead of these. And one of the main reasons that we don't want to plant ornamentals, not necessarily like wildlife benefits, like huge wildlife benefits we get from natives versus ornamentals, right? Because most of it is habitat rather than food. But it is reducing the potential for escape. Um, Grasses can and do escape into our natural areas and then can be really problematic to remove. So this is one of the examples that I found personally. On the left, this is our, um, oh, the name is escaping me. Chinese fountain grass. There it is. It's a Chinese fountain grass on the left. And then I found on the right, I was out hiking in a state park in November and I saw something still green. That, of course, caught my eye. I looked a little bit closer and I saw the seed head, this like nearly black seed head, grass seed head. And something just clicked off in my brain that I don't think this is native. And I looked it up and it was a type of Chinese fountain grass that presumably had escaped from cultivation. So it does happen. I've had lots and lots of reports of this one in particular since that time a few years ago, not just in Illinois, but from people out hiking across the country too. So something to think about if you have it planted, thinking about replacing it with a native. Um, in general, with native plants, we are mostly focusing on planting them because native plants make or break our food webs. That's because we really want to support insects that form kind of that baseline of our food web for a lot of our other critters and creatures, specifically birds in this case. And so native plants, besides providing food, right, when it comes to grasses, they provide that habitat space as well. And then if we're planting native, we're preventing the potential spread of our non-natives into our natural areas. So just why we're talking about it today, a little background info. I do want to have a moment to talk about nativars. So if you're not familiar, nativars are cultivars of native plants. And they are, again, selections of that from that wild type species that were bred to have a different characteristic for some reason or another. Okay. In many cases with our flowering plants, it changes the flower size, the flower color. In our grasses, a lot of the time it changes the levels of pigments in the leaf to get different leaf color, to have a brilliant red color or to have a blue color. That can change the ability of insects to be attracted to those leaves and to be able to feed on those leaves successfully. Many of the plants that are created are sterile, and then overall it just helps reduce genetic diversity, which isn't necessarily what we want. We want to increase genetic diversity that we have. So there's a lot of reasons that they're bred, but in general, we recommend planting the wild type plant if you're able to find it. Um, there are some exceptions, right? Some that aren't really super well behaved in a home garden, so we wouldn't necessarily want to put that in a small place or a more formal place. But in general, something to think about is working with the natural form of the plant, the natural growth pattern of the plant, rather than trying to buy a nativar of that plant that's been altered in some way that might not be beneficial to wildlife in the same way. There's tons of research being done on it. Some nativars have been found to have no impact or no effect on insects, but we're still really in the beginning phases of kind of piecing out all of those impacts. Okay, where and when to find native plants and grasses in particular. There's a lot of local native plant nurseries that you can, best listing, if you're not familiar, is at the Illinois Native Plant Society's website, which I have listed here. They also have a listing that they try to keep up to date of farmers markets that sell these plants, and then other native plant sales that happen throughout the year. So right now, November, not necessarily the best time, but come January, a lot of online nurseries, that's kind of the third option that's here. Come January, a lot of online nurseries will already be accepting orders for spring planting, and things sell out and they sell out fast. So thinking about what you want now so that when ordering opens up for the spring, you can get your order in and then pick up your plants or get your plants shipped to you when the weather is nice for planting. Some planting tips. You can plant either fall or spring. I really enjoy fall planting. I really like giving the plants a little bit of an easier transition period by giving them a few weeks in the nice fall weather. Then they go dormant and then they have the whole spring to kind of get their growth going again rather than planting for being wet is spring. It always happens later than I want it to, and then the heat of the summer can be really rough on our grasses. So, but you can do either. You can plant in the summer if you want to. You're just going to have to water more. I like to start from potted plants. So just a small little, these are 2-inch pots. Or you could do a 4-inch pot. You can do something bigger, but I find a lot of these are able to grow a huge amount in just a year or two. So I typically save my money and start small and just a little bit more patient. You can also start from seed if that's something that you're interested in doing. It is less expensive, but it's also less reliable and takes a lot more time and effort in order to grow that plant up. But if you're unable to find the plants to purchase in pots, seed might be the way to go. Okay, then when it comes to maintenance for grasses, right? A lot of these grasses are adapted to being grazed or to being in a prairie that has fire, right? We don't have either of those things in our home gardens. So how are we going to replicate that, or what are we going to do? So one of the things that we want to do is we want to leave those stems and that foliage intact through the fall and winter. Again, thinking about these grasses and sedges as habitat for our wildlife, we want to make sure that we leave those safe spaces in our gardens, those overwintering spaces for all of our critters that are going to use them. And then what I like to do is in the spring, right? Because a lot of these grasses and sedges, they're bunches. So they're going to continue to put out new growth in an area, and it's going to build up a big clump over time, right? You're going to get a lot of thatch, a lot of that dead plant material. And if you don't remove that over time, um, depending on where these are, how close they are to their house, it can be a fire hazard, right? Depending on how big the grass is. And it's just good to kind of give it a fresh start to every now and then. So typically, I never do this on time. I never cut it back before the new growth emerges. Usually, for me, it's in April, but I'm way far south in the state. So might be a little bit later, but when the weather starts to warm up, I just periodically check that grass and wait until I see the first few little green shoots start to come up from the base. And then I take my pruners and I just cut all of the foliage down right above it. So to kind of clear that out. so that that grass can be rejuvenated for that season. Okay, so at this point, I'm about halfway through my time, so we're going to move to looking at some examples. So we're going to look at, I think about 13 examples, if I remember correctly, some different native grasses and sedges, where you'd put them in your home landscape, kind of their growth requirements, and then again, if there are non-native grasses that I think they'd be a good substitute for, I'll mention those as well. Okay, so we're going to start with one of our larger ones, that's switchgrass. Okay, this is one of our Illinois prairie, tallgrass prairie species. Okay, so this is one that can get quite big, up to 6 feet tall. It does grow in a bunch and it prefers full sun. For our moisture, it can take anywhere from kind of medium, middle of the road soil moisture all the way to dry conditions. This is one that I would use as kind of a statement piece, right? As like an individual large grass or as a border. I actually just planted about 14 switchgrasses to try to make a living fence along one side of my yard. And so hopefully over the next few years, they'll get large enough that they'll kind of grow together and form that nice border. Why do I like this grass so much? In the fall, it does turn kind of a goldenish brown color, not necessarily like striking yellow, but has a beautiful fall color. And the leaves do curl when they dry or senesce, and it provides a little bit of a visual interest too. This one, since it can get quite large, I would replace the non-native Chinese silvergrass, which is this one right here. It's also called a maiden grass or miscanthus. There are some species of miscanthus that are invasive, and this one is super, super popular. I see it planted all the time. And then as I'm driving, I see it planted in home landscape, and then I look at the kind of scrubby area across the street that no one maintains, and I see it popped up over there. So it does spread, it does get out. So I consider kind of something with a similar form would be that switchgrass. Okay, next, probably my favorite grass, even though that's really hard for me to pick just one, is little blue stem. Um, this one actually not related to big blue stem as closely as some other grasses. They're in different genera, but this one stays typically pretty short, 2 to 3 feet tall. I don't know what happened to mine. It was taller than me this year, so I'm not sure what happened, but that's not typical. Usually you're going to stay under 3 feet tall. Has this beautiful bunch form that you can see in the photos, and it prefers full sun and kind of drier conditions, but it can handle a little bit moister soil too. This one's great to kind of edge an area or as a statement grass. And then as I said before, that red-orange color. And then in the fall too, it has its seeds are these like fluffy white seeds. They kind of look like they remind me of eyelashes and really, really beautiful. This is also a good example in this picture. You can see this whole area right here is like as the bunch continues to grow and get bigger, and it doesn't look like they've cut back the previous foliage. So something to think about. It can just really build up a big bulk at the base of your plant if you don't do that. That's little blue stem. Another a delicate smaller grass is side oats grama. This one, again, is going to be a similar height, 2 to 3 feet. It does grow in a bunch, but it's not going to form as a robust a bunch as the little blue stem, right? You could see how densely packed all of those stems were. Side oats is a little bit more delicate, so if you wanted to have like a really striking bunch of it, I plant multiple of them in a clump. It's going to like the same types of conditions, full sun, medium to dry soil. I'd use it as kind of an edger in a home garden. And it has really beautiful, delicate seeds that are typically reddish green when they are in bloom. And then on the right here, this is kind of like the straw yellow color that it is in the fall. This one too, if you catch it in bloom, I don't have a picture of it here, but the stamens or the male part of the plant are bright red. So for at least a week or two, you can see that really brilliant color in this grass. Okay, maybe my favorite grass for the home landscape, see what I did there? I'm going to break it up so I can have multiple favorites, is prairie dropseed. And this is one of the most popular, commonly planted native plants, even including flowering herbaceous native plants that we have in the Midwest. So prairie dropseed, I highly recommend for everyone. It's a really, really great visual interest plant. So this one is going to stay, we say 1 to 3 feet tall because usually the foliage, the greenery itself is under a foot tall. And then when it flowers, those flowering stalks can get up to 3 feet tall. It is a bunch grass, loves full sun, medium to dry soil. Again, I'd use it in the same ways as the last two. But it produces these really, really dense clusters of really, really fine, thin leaves that kind of arch and form these beautiful clumps. It has these airy open panicles that when they get to the right ripeness, either smell like buttered popcorn or cilantro, is what I've heard from different people. They smell like buttered popcorn to me. Walking outside in my home garden about a month ago, it like hit me full force. And I don't have a huge number of these, but that smell was definitely there. So kind of a different one, something you could add into a sensory garden too, to have that different smell. This one I would use to replace the non-native fountain grasses, so the ones that I talked about that I had found escaped. So with those, there's a few different ones. There's a Chinese fountain grass, a crimson fountain grass, and then there's many, many, many different cultivars of them that change the color of the seed heads for the most part. But you can see it kind of has similar form, right? Really tight bunch, lots of that arching greenery, and then especially with the light colored one on the right, kind of, we could see that mimicked in the prairie dropseed. Okay. Another one that I absolutely love, depending on where you plant it, is river oats, also called inland oats or sea oats. All the same plant, lots of different names for it. This one can get up to 4 feet tall. Rather than a bunch grass, it is a spreader, and it is a pretty aggressive spreader. So it's an excellent grass in the right locations, but it can take over if it's not planted in the right conditions. This one, it can handle full sun. You typically see it planted in part shade, and it does well in the shade as well. It may change the color of the grass. So in the left picture, if you look at the leaves, they're kind of this really um, bright, like more lime green, whereas they have a much darker green in the right. So that's different sunlight. On the left, that was full sun, and you get the darker green color in the shade. They can handle a little bit more moisture in the soil. And I just love this grass. It's just so different visually from the really flattened, like oat-like spikelets that you see that turn like that golden orange color to the really broad, wide, fat leaves, which is a little bit different than the other grasses we've looked at. This one I've seen, this clump in particular was at a zoo and it was edged right by pavement and an edger. So that was a great containment for it. This one I think I'm going to plant in a shady um, like tree hedge area where we've been removing invasives, and I kind of just want to fill in the space, and it's surrounded by a mowed lawn, so it can't really spread too far. So that would be a good location for that. But planted, in the middle of a garden setting without any edging or barriers, maybe not the best choice uh, for this one. This one I think would be a good replacement for Japanese forest grass. Not one that I've seen myself personally, but it has others that I know of have seen it in botanic gardens. And I chose it kind of because the color, the shape of the leaf in that bunch, and it grows in shadier areas. So good replacement for that one. Okay. Another great grass for shade is bottlebrush grass. This one is going to be a little bit more understated in how it looks, and a little bit taller than some of the other ones too. So 3 to 5 feet in height. Not a bunch grass. It does spread slowly over time, but not nearly as aggressive as the last one we looked at. This one's going to be a shade grass, so part to full shade, medium soil. So great for the shade garden. Love it because of this bottle brush shaped seed head that we have in the fall. And again, I would use this as a replacement for the taller fountain grasses that we have, like the crimson fountain grass, which can get about 5 feet tall. Okay. Another great prairie grass, kind of switching back to the full sun ones, is June grass. June grass is more of a northern Illinois to um, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas grass. We don't have it really that much down in southern Illinois by me, but this is a great one. It stays relatively short, 1 to 2 feet tall, forms this adorable little bunch. Does well in full sun, would be a great edging plant, a short front edging plant for a landscape bed. Has these really pretty silvery to reddish colored seed heads, and it blooms in June, as per the name. And this one, although it's much shorter than the non-native grass I have here, I think it looks very similar to the feather reed grass that you've probably seen before, even if you didn't know what it was called. So this one is super popular, planted in a lot of landscape beds. So again, it is a much taller version, but if you're looking for something with kind of a similar look, that June grass is a good replacement. Okay. Next up is purple love grass. So this is one if you're looking for color in a grass, and it's really, 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 really hard to photograph. So you can't really see a whole bunch of the grass here, but was really trying to capture that purple color in this photo. So this one is another short one. It's going to stay under 2 feet tall. It is a bunch grass, and it likes full sun. This one you could even plant as a ground cover. And it does form these large bunches for an individual grass with these purple seed heads. And in the purple love grass, it's the short plant, right? 1 to 2 feet tall. But the panicle or the arrangement of the flowers is like more than half the size of the plant. So it really does a lot of bang for its buck with that purple color. And this one you could replace other purple grasses, right? So purple moorgrass is an ornamental, that crimson fountain grass. If you're looking for that purple color, right? They're going to have a little bit different form. But this is one purple moorgrass that has been planted and has been shown to escape as well. Okay, this might be my last grass before we switch to the sedges. Beak grass. This was that one that I said kind of looked like a sedge, spikelet, or that flower. This is one that is going to stay, again, typically under 2 feet tall. It does form a nice bunch, and it likes partial to full shade, kind of medium soil moisture. For this one, you could use it as a ground cover that just has a bonus flowering stalk that looks beautiful in the fall. And I really like it because it has these really arched leaves that are really shiny. So you can see that in the photo on the right. All of the leaves arch very strongly, kind of show their shiny undersides. So it's a great grass if you need a ground cover a um, in a shade garden. I planted a bunch of them in my home garden in a partial shade garden, and they're doing really, really well. These are some of the ones that have flowered in my garden that I'm showing here for the first year, so that's exciting. Okay, I was right. We're going to switch to the sedges now and talk about a few sedges. I don't have as much experience. I just put a few sedges into my garden this year, but did find a few recommendations from the Mount Cuba Center on ones that they have used, and this was one of the ones that they recommended. And this is woods sedge. And one of the things I did find too, when it comes to the common names of these plants, if you're searching for them, make sure you include the scientific name because there are a lot of different wood sedges that aren't necessarily this one. So just keep that in mind when searching these names. This one's going to stay really short, so it's a great ground cover option, under a foot tall. It is clumping, but it will slowly spread over time. And this is really great. It can handle full shade all the way to full sun. So really versatile sedge. likes medium moisture right in the middle and is great for a ground cover, right? That's how I would use this one, especially because it can form really dense mats over time, kind of fill in an area that might be hard to plant in, and give it that visual, that green interest. Okay, this one we saw a picture of earlier. This is palm sedge. This one's a little bit showier. If you want a larger sedge, you get up to 3 feet tall. Again, it's clumping, so kind of like a bunch grass, but will slowly spread over time. Similar light, full shade to full sun. And again, similar moisture, really kind of right in the middle. This is more of a statement sedge though, rather than a ground cover. Really, really like these densely packed leaves. Kind of does resemble like a palm frond, which is really cool. We added some of this into one of our gardens this year, and it's done really well with not a huge amount of water, and it is in full sun. So again, you can see that really bright, bright green color that you're going to get with that more sun exposure. Okay, this is not a great picture of gray sedge. It's in the background in the back right. I didn't have an individual. I know I've taken individual pictures of the one at my home, and for some reason I can't find it. So you get a beautiful picture of my phlox that was in bloom next to my gray sedge in the back. But this one is going to be a bit taller, 2 to 3 feet. Again, same. It's going to be a clumper, but will slowly spread over time. Again, a lot of people say full to partial shade. Mine's in full sun and it's doing excellent. This one can definitely handle some more moisture. But for me, I have it in a pretty dry spot and I don't regularly water and it's doing great. This one definitely more of a statement piece because of the star-shaped globe flowers that you can kind of see in this picture. Again, don't have a close-up photo of this one, but you could also put it in a rain garden. This would be a great option for that. And then that visual interest comes from those spiky fruits, those star-shaped fruits. Okay, the next two look really, really similar. And for the most part, their characteristics are very similar. So Eastern Star Sedge is going to stay, again, under 1 foot tall. Similar clumper, slowly spreads. This one's going to need some shade. So full to partial shade, medium soil moisture. Great as a ground cover, but when it's in flower, right, it is more of a statement piece with those star-shaped fruits, and then has that beautiful finely textured foliage. So keep this one in mind, Eastern Star Sedge. Here we have Rosy Sedge. And this one, again, really similar, but it can handle drier conditions. So kind of depending on your soil moisture, that would lead me to decide between Eastern Star Sedge and this Rosy Sedge. But both really great options, really great, beautiful ground cover options. I would love to have this one in my garden. Okay, so I'm about wrapped up. So I'm going to stop here and just show some examples. Again, just this is from around my home garden here in the fall. The fall is really the time when the grasses shine. So on the left, this is my prairie dropseed that's in bloom right next to my aster with one of our hackberries in the background. I just loved that color all together. Again, these are more of my prairie drop seeds that are blooming in the fall, and then that beet grass, again, that has that beautiful seed head in the fall. So just want to throw those in there as a few examples as we finish up today. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with some resources. So today we focused a lot, of course, on the home garden, but I do have a whole suite of resources all under this title, Grasses at a Glance. So I do a blog, usually it's twice a month, but I did just wrap up for the growing season. But you can find, I think 3 years of archived blogs. If you go to this go.illinois.edu/grasses, you can subscribe so you get an email every time I post a new blog if you're really into it. I do have a series of short videos to help with grass identification. So if that's something you're looking at getting more into, I have about 25 individual grass species. They're like 1 to 2 minute videos where I just point out key characteristics with video and then voiceover. And then also, if you're looking for more information on identifying grasses, I have 5 or 6 webinars that are recorded on YouTube as well. So you can find, if you just search grasses at a glance, it'll pop up and you can find all of these resources. But just to give you a little bit more information on kind of identifying grasses, you can use these resources. But at this point, that is where I'm going to stop and see if we have any questions. And I want to thank everyone for coming. I really enjoy talking about grasses, and it's usually hard to find a person who is. So I was happy to be here and share that with you all today.
That was fantastic. I know that was definitely a blind spot for me in terms of my knowledge. So I learned a lot, and I think I'm sure other folks on the line did as well. So thank you so much for that great presentation. We just have one question in the chat so far. So folks, if you have anything, now's the time to drop it in. I'll go to the question we have from Emily. And she's asking if any of the sedges that you mentioned are evergreen.
Yes, that is a great question. I believe that most of them are that I mentioned. I don't know of any sedges, honestly, that aren't evergreen. So I'm going to say by default, most of them are. But you could look individual like species up, right, and see just to double check. But the ones that I've planted or that I've seen, you know, hiking in the woods in the wintertime, I always see them stay pretty evergreen.
Right. And then Sue and Bill put a question in the chat, and they're asking, when is the best time to divide sedges?
That's a good question as well. I would say either the fall or the spring, but like I mentioned before, I find that plants have an easier time with that kind of division and planting in the fall. So that's what I would recommend.
Oops, I just realized I was on mute. I'm moving on to a question from Laura. What do you recommend as grasses die out from the center?
As grasses die out from the center, that can be challenging. So that can be the natural growth, right, of grasses. And that's kind of one of the reasons too why I recommend kind of cutting them down, that maintenance. But I know over time there are certain grasses that do just, right, naturally die back. At that point, you could try dividing them. But when we've talked about the root systems, it can be really, really challenging again to divide them at that point. So I don't have any tricks to make them like they're not going to grow back in the middle anymore. So if it is possible to divide, you could divide off, right? Maybe divide into quarter chunks and kind of start over again and transplant those. But otherwise, there isn't really anything that you can do to kind of prevent that or kind of get it to come back.
That's helpful to know. Moving on to a question from Silvana. Can you group various grasses, or is it better to group similar grasses in the garden?
Oh, that's a great question. Kind of depends on your preference. One of the things that I didn't talk about was planting in clumps. And in general, I like to plant not just one um, grass or any plant individually, but I like to plant in groups of odd numbers. So in 3s or 5s is typically what I like to do. I tried to get some pictures, but it was really hard this time of year to show it in my garden. But typically I do groups of 3. But you saw with that one picture at the beginning, they had kind of a clump of one type of grass with a clump of another type of grass in front and another one next to it. So you can definitely mix and match. Just kind of depends on how robust that grass is itself or how delicate it is too, right? You don't want them to be overpowered. I know I put in side oats, grandma, and I just put in 2 and they disappeared into the garden because they're so delicate. So with those, you definitely want to mass more of a similar species together. But others definitely, I like to mix and match and get a lot of different things in there, but maybe clumps of individuals next to clumps of other individual grasses is how I would approach it.
Great. And then moving back to another question from Emily. She is asking, are there any native grasses that you would not recommend for a small home garden due to aggressive self-seeding?
That's a good question. Yes. So a lot of the times with the grasses, it's not necessarily the reseeding that we're concerned about, but the spreading from rhizomes. So a lot of our grasses are naturally rhizomatous, right? So under the ground, they're going to send out runners and they're going to send up new shoots. And so I specifically didn't include a few grasses like big blue stem and Indian grass in a small garden because they can very easily get aggressive and take over. The only other one I wouldn't plant is that river oats. That one does have a lot of self-seeding. That's what we're finding in the garden that we planted 3 clumps, is we have tons of little babies now. It's the whole bed under it is just river oats that we have to weed out to keep it under control. But a lot of the other ones, like the little blue stem, side oats, prairie drop seed. Um, they don't send out runners for the most part. They're not rhizomatous in that way. And I haven't seen like tons of seeds start to germinate. So trying to think, switchgrass might spread a little bit. But that one typically stays more of a bunch than like the big blue or the Indian grass.
And then Laura has a question. Do you ever try planting a forb in that dead center?
I haven't. You could try. I'm thinking of the died out centers of grasses that I've seen before, and it's like a solid like massive roots. So I don't know if you'd be able to actually get in and plant something in there. But if you are, you could try it. I'm all for trying things out and seeing if it works.
Laura, you'll have to try that out and report back. Let us know how it goes. Um, and then this is a comment from Martha. Martha says, thank you so much. Very encouraged to add grasses and especially sedges to our home garden. We have a lot of shade. So just wanted to highlight that comment there. And then we're getting to our last question here. So this one is from Mary. And Mary's asking, any grass / sedge in particular that you would suggest for a rain garden?
For a rain garden in general, we'd go with, and we're thinking like the bottom of a rain garden, right? The part that gets the most moisture. We're definitely going to want to go with more of the sedges than the grasses. And then it just kind of depends on the height and the visual interest that you want. I personally love the gray sedge. I think a lot of people are finding it's a little bit maybe overused in landscaping at this point, but I like it because it is kind of a hefty sedge that does take up, it's up to 3 feet tall and really, really beautiful. But there's so many, like hundreds of different sedges. I only touched on a few, so definitely I'd encourage you to look up some online native plant nurseries that have a big selection just to kind of piece through and look at what seed heads you really like that you'd want to add in. But lots and lots of options. I'd stick with the sedges for the rain garden.
Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for the great questions and thank you, Erin. I think that brings us to the end of the questions. So I will pass it back to Sue to wrap us up.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Erin. I learned a lot today. I found a sedge I didn't know was a sedge in my garden, and I've enjoyed it, and now I know I could get more of them. I find it interesting that grasses seem to be, I don't think they're a recent change in gardens, but I don't remember growing up and seeing grasses being used as much as they are now. Is that something that's more recent or not?
I would say, a lot of the ornamental grasses have been around for a long time, but I think we're now starting to see in the native plant movement, right, that seems to be continuing to gather traction year after year after year. We're seeing that there's a lot more options. That's not just in our flowering plants, right? But that there's a lot of great grass options out there too. So yeah, I am seeing a lot more grass. I always get excited when I see grasses planted, but even in more, like outside doctor's offices, I'll see prairie drop seed and I'm like, oh, I wasn't expecting to see that there. So it is gaining a lot more traction, I would say. Yeah, especially because a lot of them are drought tolerant. So they're great options, right? For more of those landscaped areas.
And how did you get so interested in grasses?
I don't really know, honestly. I really enjoy plant identification. That was something that just really spoke to me in grad school. I really enjoyed it, and I was really frustrated that there weren't a lot of grass identification resources. And so I decided to, and I worked a couple field survey jobs where I had to identify grasses as part of that work and grasses that weren't flowering. So I had to learn how to identify them just from their leaves a lot of the times and figured that I should share that with other people. And now I'm known as the grass lady. So this things just evolve over time.
Well, thank you so much for your time tonight. I know we've all learned something, and we really appreciate you spending time with us. So thank you.